This presentation is on affective assessment from chapter 10 in the course textbook. So we'll use a verse to kind of illustrate the idea of what it means to what the affect part means. This is from 2 Corinthians 8, 7 and 8. So I'll just take a minute to read it here with you. Therefore, as ye abound in everything, in faith, in utterance, and knowledge, and in all diligence, and in your love to us, see that ye abound in this grace also. I speak not by commandment, but by occasion of the forwardness of others, and to prove the sincerity of your love. So the idea was you're proving your sincerity of the love. Okay, he mentions your love to us earlier in the verse there. So how are you going to show, if you say that you have love, how are you going to show that? Okay, now it's going to be obvious in your actions, right? And in this case, the grace that they're referring to is giving. So he's talking about sharing the physical resources, the money or whatever resources you have, sharing them with others. And most specifically, we're talking about tithing and giving offerings at church. And Paul was saying this will show the sincerity of your love, that you abound in this grace also. So he was saying, if I see the behavior, I will infer that you have love in their hearts. And that's what testing and assessment do. We infer learning by seeing performance. Okay, so that's just kind of something for you to think about. But we'll kind of use that idea of the sincerity of your love, but just as an idea of an affect, something that it involves more like how you feel about something, more than what you can do. So not your knowledge of math, but how much you like math or don't like math, as the case may be. And your text authors make a case that as a teacher, you should think about that. You should be concerned about that. Okay, so I'm going to introduce some terms. I have some slides with really just one or two words on them. The next 3 or 4 slides would be like that to help us understand how we collect information about affective assessment, about how students feel about things. Okay, so when we do it, we're going to use what's called a Likert scale. Looks like it should be pronounced Likert, I think, but it is Likert, and it is after a man who developed this type of scale. That's why we have that name. Mr. Likert developed it. So a Likert scale, I'm sure you're familiar with them. It's strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, that kind of thing, okay? Usually there's a neutral in there so that you could, strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. I'm sure you filled out many surveys like that. That is a Likert scale. Now you are going to have to simplify that if you're working with elementary. Okay, so Michaela's thinking about preschooler. She's not going to be able to use terms like that, but she might be able to use a smiley face and a sad face, right? Or you might even just want to, it might not be like disagree, it might be yes, maybe, no, sometimes. Okay, so there are various versions of it, but the idea is that there's a continuum of like or dislike or agreement or disagreement, happiness, sadness, that kind of thing. Okay, the continuum is what's known as a Likert scale. Now, when you make a survey for students to answer, you want to make sure that we use realistic statements. Okay, so statements like algebra is my favorite subject ever, or I always love to do algebra homework, okay, or I hate algebra more than anything. Okay, those are extremes. It's probably not anybody who always loves to do algebra homework, okay, or who hates it more than anything. A statement like, I enjoy learning when I do algebra homework, or I would rather do other things than algebra homework, right? Or algebra homework is hard for me. Algebra homework is easy for me. Okay. So, and it might not, if they say algebra homework is easy for me, that doesn't mean that they've never had a hard question. Okay. It's just in general, how do they think about algebra? It's easy for me. It's hard for me. It's sometimes hard and sometimes easy, right? Okay. So that's where they would register their agreement. If you make a statement like algebra is easy for me, then they would say strongly agree, disagree, like that. Okay. But it has to be realistic statements. Anonymity is a really important feature of the affective assessment. So that means that you do not know who answered this question, okay? No names, no handwritten components, and a secure method of turning it in. Those are things that we do to try and ensure anonymity, okay? So that, and the purpose for that is to encourage honesty. We don't want students to think that, for instance, that their grade is tied to a comment that they say. We want them to be able to safely say that um, algebra homework is hard for me without fearing that that's going to come down on them. You know, teacher's going to have a bad attitude toward them, or, that kind of thing. So anonymity is a really important point of this. And then this is from the teacher's side of it, is the group-based inferences. So when a teacher reads these assessments, you're not supposed to try and figure out who wrote them and say, oh, I'm sure that's this student, okay? Or sometimes you might even have what we call outliers. So somebody who just totally hates everything, right? Or at least that's their attitude right now. Or maybe they're saying that to cover up for the fact that they didn't try very hard. So if they can, blame shift it somewhere else. Or telling you that this is the best algebra course ever, right? Nothing ever better than this. Those are outliers, okay? So those tend to get ignored, right? Or at least you have to take them with a grain of salt, okay? But the idea is that you look at overall what was the message from from this assessment, okay? The majority of your students think this, okay? The majority of your students take 30 minutes on algebra. So maybe you could say, have a statement on there. Algebra homework takes me 30 minutes to complete on average. And they might say, no way. So you might find out, oh, wow. Most of them think it takes a lot longer than 30 minutes to do their homework. I didn't realize that. Maybe that's why some of them aren't completing it anymore, right? But you make group-based inferences, not trying to figure out who said what. Now, I will just make a comment here. One of the, it's actually like a fitness group that I joined online just for some inspiration and try to help me get going here. And one of the things I appreciate, I opened one of her pages and it said, attitude is everything, so get a good one. And I just thought that was so great. I feel like I could post that on all the walls, right? Attitude is everything, so get a good one. And your text author makes the point that, why should a teacher care about affective inventory? Because we want our students to like our class. They're going to work harder if they like it, if they enjoy it. And I think that's very true. And you certainly don't want to make class a stressful, like all we do is work hard in here. We never smile, or there are never any helps given to people, or never any exceptions for late work. Or do you know what I'm saying? We don't we don't want to make them work so hard that they actually come out hating the subject. Okay, that is very true. And as a teacher, if you know that students struggle with the subject, you are going to work harder to look for good illustrations or to make it easier to understand. Or, and I'll just give you an example here. One of my mentor teachers was teaching junior high math at the time, and she had a group of middle schoolers coming into her who she knew they struggled with math, and she knew they did not like math. And she also knew that she was the last stop before high school, and she wanted them to not only have an improved attitude toward math, but she also wanted them to learn math. I mean, it's no good if they love math but they aren't learning any math. I mean, that doesn't work either. So she did a lot of after school help groups, and she would bring in like snacks and things that she knew, favorite drinks and treats for them, so that because she knew they would be hungry, and junior high kids always like to eat, right? So but she was determined that not only were they going to have a better attitude about math, but that they were going to learn something. And that was kind of how she chose to overcome that obstacle. And I've always thought of that as a great example where she didn't bring the standards down, just make the class easy so everybody likes it. But she did her best to help those students. And then she tried to soften the after school tutoring with some treats kind of thing. And I think that is a really good example of this, and of this thinking anyway, that should characterize your teaching. And that's kind of where you're the servant leader to your students as well. But I also think that all of us are responsible for our attitudes. And sometimes prayer is going to be your best tool to help a student get a different attitude. Taking a survey isn't going to solve it. Finding out, you probably already knew they had a bad attitude. So sometimes prayer, and trying to develop some kind of relationship with them might be your best um, weapon against a bad attitude. But I also think it's helpful for students to understand that an attitude is something that they choose. So having some, slogans like that up in your classroom, like, attitude is everything, so get a good one. Um, I had similar posters, that kind of thing, up in my classroom to promote the positive attitude. In lower grades, I always had um, posters and signs up to promote reading, positive attitudes, benefits, enjoyment of reading. And so we have to kind of educate our students as well too. I don't want you to think that you just do everything so they'll like you or they'll like your class. I mean, you can't. That's not using integrity. So it is important to us, but we want to help our students develop the right kind of attitudes as well. So here are the steps to making this assessment tool that your text author talks about. The first thing you have to do is select your variables. So you have to decide, and I've been using the example of an algebra class. You can obviously change that to whatever you're teaching. But so what do you want to know? Is it, like the length of time they spend doing their homework? Is it just their personal like or dislike of a class? I think you always want to be careful with that, because I always want to encourage students that, if they don't like a class, there's probably a reason why. So usually the more we know about something, the more we like it, the more tolerance we have for it. So, I find I never, I like working in the yard a lot now. Just give you an example here. But when I first started doing more yard work, I have to say it was hard because I didn't know much about it, about planting new plants or how to fix a lawnmower when it didn't want to start or those kind of things. But the more I've done it, the more I've learned, and the more I've learned to enjoy it. So kind of maybe that will help you like select the variables. What do you want to know about what your students are thinking? So is it how much time they spend on homework? Is it that they, that they don't understand it, or that it makes them feel like they don't understand it, or that it's too early in the morning when we have algebra class, or, just thinking about like the different variables and getting a read on students. So maybe they need more help in class before the homework is assigned. Or maybe they need more explanation after they've tried the homework. Maybe they need to start their homework in class. Maybe they need to work with a partner. Okay, those are all things that you're trying to think about. What should go in this inventory? Okay, and then you want to write a positive and a negative statement for each variable. So that means, I'll give you an example, like if you were doing it, if you wanted to know if students liked working with a partner or if they liked working on their own. So you might write a statement that said, I like to work on my own. And then students would say they strongly agree with that, they agree with that, they are neutral, right? There would be a Likert scale attached to that. I like to work on my own, okay? Then another statement might say, working by myself is hard. Okay, so they should answer those differently, right? If they say, I like to work on my own, that should be more like an agree or strongly agree. Working by myself is hard. That should be a disagree. Those two statements should get opposite answers. If they like to work on their own, then they should respond negatively to working by myself is hard. But you understand how you write a positive and a negative statement for each variable. So, I finish my algebra homework in less than 30 minutes. And then another statement that would be kind of like the opposite would be, my algebra homework takes me at least an hour to complete, or more than an hour to complete. Okay, again, students should be answering those differently. If they're answering everything honestly, so you have a positive and a negative statement for each variable. Now, you have different variables. So remember, we said, like, algebra is my favorite subject. There are other subjects I like more than algebra. Okay, so how much time they spend on their homework, or they like working with a partner, or they need more teacher help. Those are all different variables. Okay, you have to have a positive and a negative statement for each one of those. But you don't have to have the same number of statements for each variable. Okay, so if I want to know like how much time they're spending on homework, or how much they like group work, I could have 3 or 4 statements. Maybe I should say 3 or 4 ideas about group work. But each of those ideas has to come with a positive and a negative. But maybe I only need one idea related to the amount of time they spend on their homework. So I need a positive and negative for that one idea. But I don't have to have an equal number about time they spent on homework as I do have on whether they like to work with a partner or not. Okay? So it gets kind of confusing when you think about that. The main thing that you should remember is that you should have a positive and a negative statement for each variable. And then those statements are randomly placed in the inventory. So let's go back to my example of, I like to work on my own. And then the opposite of that, working by myself is hard. Okay, well, I don't put those statements right next to each other. So I like to work on my own might be the first statement in my inventory. Working by myself is hard might be the 5th statement. Okay, so you're trying not to make it too obvious that you're asking these questions both ways. So why? Because you're trying to get students to think carefully about their responses. Okay, and again, when you take it apart and you analyze it, you're hoping that students answered those questions in opposite ways. They were opposite sentences. If they don't answer them in opposite ways, you know that they either were being honest, or they weren't reading carefully, or they just don't know. Okay, they're just confused. So they do like to work on their own, but they think it's hard. You know what I'm saying? So, um, but you're looking for a clear response. And if you make it too obvious that they're together, then students won't think through each statement carefully. Then you choose your response format. So again, if you're teaching real little children, you're probably going to use like a smiley face, a straight face, and a sad face. You might use yes, no sometimes, or you might have a full-fledged strongly disagree, agree, neutral, agree, and strongly agree. Okay, but you're choosing that response format. That's the next step. And then finally, make sure that you write clear directions. So you want students to know, how do they respond? Do they color in a little circle? Do they underline something? You know, how do they do that? And usually it's good to have a sample item. A good analogy for this is if you just think about when you go to vote. Usually they have a sample question and they show you how to mark the ballot. They tell it to you in writing, fill in the circle completely with a black pen, and then they show you a sample. Then you make a request for anonymous, honest answers and a reminder that there are no right or wrong answers. They can, you know, that this is not for a grade. This is for information purposes. Okay. And then remember, when you see those answers, right, you are going to make group-based inferences on them so that you can best help your class. You can know that you're hopefully on the right track. You know, you're helping students understand the content, or, you know, maybe you could even do it like the pictures that I use to help you understand. They make the information more clear to you. Um, the PowerPoint, you know, you can have a question about the PowerPoint that you use, or when we use Chromebooks as opposed to like a paper text or something like that. It will help you to help your students hopefully enjoy class better. And, you know, it'll give you a reading on like the tools that you're using, the methods that you're using, that kind of thing. And then I'll just close with this reminder, just because again I've been saying this quote to myself, and I just think it's such a good one, that you want to have this it, down for you, and you want to encourage your students that attitude is everything. So get a good one.